Let me go ahead and just open by saying that I recommend you play this game. Recommendation, go. It is a story-heavy, story-centric, story-driven Metroidvania. If that's not enough, then, well, we'll keep discussing it. Because, of course, first we're going to talk about the gameplay axis. Now, as we were going through, I'm going to go ahead and admit that going into this game immediately after Cyber Shadow was a hell of a jolt. Because Cyber Shadow is an extremely precise, beautifully crafted platformer, and this is not. On the gameplay axis. Now, you're probably thinking, Lord, you gave this like plus 25 to gameplay. And I did. And I gave Cyber Shadow plus 31. But the point here is, a lot of what the game really does well isn't quite on the platforming axis. It does do quite a few things well. The guidance and flow of exploration is excellent. I never got lost once. At no point did I feel like, now what? There was always at least something else to do. This is partially due to the map. The map is actually very simple looking and very much inspired by Soten, that is to say Castlevania Symphony of the Night, which I will hereafter refer to as Soten. But at the same time, it's actually better than Soten's in several ways. It has clear indicators of when there's places you haven't been, both in terms of whether something's filled out and whether there's like a very clear hole in one of the walls. The walls themselves are nice and thick, so you can see them at a glance, and there's color coding to indicate where is what and where. And, of course, you actually have the ability to set your own markers in order to map things for your own sake. It is actually a very useful map, especially since you get it as a mini-map as well. So that's all awesome. So, no getting lost. Lots of things like... When I say flow of exploration, this is usually more of a Metroid kind of a thing. But I've talked about this before. Let's say you're going over here, and there's this one section of the wall, and the path goes down, but there's a section of the wall just over here. So you go up and you smack it, and sure enough, there's something there. There isn't always something there, but the very design of the terrain draws your attention in directions, sometimes which pays off, sometimes which doesn't, which leads you to finding new areas, and yada yada. The game also uses an actual key system, in terms of the, I think it's the it's C, B, V, and A keys. And once you have the A key, you've unlocked everything. And that only applies in the future, too. That's another thing. I'm going to be referring to Soten a bunch, but that's because I'm very, very familiar with Soten. But really, this game feels far more inspired by the DS Castlevanias, if anything, in a good way. It looks like it took several of those ideas and said, yeah, let's run with that. Imagine if you played Soten, but someone actually cleaned up the interface so it actually looked decent and was worth a damn and wasn't a constant pain to re-equip things or change stuff around, then you've kind of got an idea there. The platforming is there. It's not bad. So this is kind of why I say this is an interesting game to compare to Cyber Shadow. Let me go and compare the two biggest differences between the two. The first is the aforementioned, platforming. It's not really much of a platformer game, as weird as that sounds. You're probably thinking lore. But no, hear me out. There's sections of the map where you're just going left to right. There's an enemy in the way which you have to jump over. There's sections of the map where there's like a staircase here and a staircase here and a staircase here, and you're just going up. That's not really platforming level design in what I usually consider that as, like the aforementioned Cyber Shadow or Mega Man or Mario or whatever, right? Instead, the platforming is entirely subservient to the form of the Metroidvania-ness. So you're probably thinking, based on how I phrase this, that the level design isn't, that it's not designed, but it actually is. There's a really wonderful flow to it that I can't visually indicate, which effectively has, this is the area you can do, and then you go do this stuff, which lets you do this stuff, which lets you do this stuff, and it's almost always a literal back and forth, to the right edge of the map, to the left edge of the map, to the right edge of the map, and then you find a way to go down, and you go up, down, and there's just this thing, as you go through, the map very naturally and very organically flows. This is part of the aforementioned. I've used that word a lot today. Sorry, I'm really tired. I know. I'm, Lord, you're supposed to be getting more sleep. I actually sleep better. I'm just sick right now. So, when you're sick, you wake up at 4 a.m. and you can't back to bed. That's me right now. So bear with me, please. The flow of it, as mentioned before, saying it slightly differently, and the way that it allows you to kind of rubber band around is awesome. And you're probably thinking, Lord, this sounds terrible for backtracking. Well, it would, if not for the waypoint system. Now, we've talked a lot about the difference between fast travel and waypoint systems, but to get it across very, very quickly, a fast travel system is when you can go to a location from where you are. Most Zelda games have that. A waypoint system is when you go to one of the waypoints and can warp to another waypoint. See Diablo 2 or Witcher 3 for 2 examples of that. That's what this game has. Now, waypoint systems aren't necessarily positives because usually they're just kind of there to make it so that the backtracking isn't terrible. But the placement of them is once again very smart in this, especially since the placement is almost identical in both timelines, which I haven't even really mentioned yet. So in other words, you can pretty much always say, okay, that's going to be here, and this gets me here. And so when you're doing this back and forth exploration thing, it's more like warp, 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 and so forth and so on. And again, effectively what's happening is you are exploring in a, I don't want to say a linear manner, but in a progressive manner. You're always expanding and exploring until you have everything, of course. Until you reach a point where you decide to do something else. It's all on you. I was being very methodical because it's me, and I've played Metroidvania since whenever Metroid 1 came out. But you get the point. So that's cool. The other big variance, though, the other reason that this is an odd one to talk about is the combat. So this is much more of an RPG in its bones than it is a platformer, even though this is, it is technically a platformer and it is a Metroidvania, to be assured, as I just mentioned. The way the game is structured is much more RPG in design. I'm not just talking about levels. How many games have levels at this point? That doesn't mean anything. No, what I mean is how the game is structured. You get levels, and that's cool, and that gives you more health and defense and a few other things, but you also get equipment, which that's cool, and that gives you stuff. But what really matters here is how you progress your build. So you have your 4 equipment slots, your 2 orb slots, your magic slot, and your augmented slots, okay? All of this stuff is part of your build. The equipment isn't super necessary. That's mostly just stats, straight up vertical leveling, just like your levels are. But everything else, that's your horizontal leveling, your build, as I just mentioned. Now, for those of you who never heard me use that phrase before, build gameplay is when you can build your character in whatever manner you want to in order to play it the way that you want to. Duh, right? Guild Wars 1, Magic the Gathering, building a deck, that kind of thing. That's a build, right? The important thing when it comes to build gameplay is not just letting the player choose, though, because that leads to something usually referred to as the illusion of choice. What you need to do is you need to make multiple builds viable. If multiple builds are viable, then you've got build gameplay, which, of course, this one does. The things that I started off with, of course, I used blue because that's what you start with. I ended up leaning very heavily on a combination of the fire sword and the blade sword, the fire orb and the sword orb early on, until I got the radiant orb, and then I used that for the rest of the game. But I poked at all of them as we were going through them. There's a nice big slow attack. There's a really, really fast rapid-fire dagger-style attack. There's a long-range attack. There's a very thin, it only hits like a very narrow thing in front of you attack. It's the gun one. But it's hit scan, so it just instantly hits, and it pierces, so it goes straight through whatever it's hitting. There's also a really big, I mentioned the hammer one already. There's one of wind. I already mentioned that one. There's ice. That's kind of the way to attack down and in front of you, just to destroy whatever's at your feet. The holy water equivalent from Castlevania. All of these attack differently, and each of them, as you level them, also buff other things, like your spells and your accessories. So, the accessories have a stronger effect the higher level the orb they're attached to is, and the spells are stronger the higher level the orb they're attached to is. Each orb has its own spell, but you don't have to use that one. For example, I didn't use, I kept using the blade sword for quite a while. Or the blade sword, I keep saying that, blade sword, the blade spell, the sword spell. 4 a.m. throughout much of the gameplay, because it's just a really big, huge reach, huge attack that hits half the screen, which obviously is valuable to me. I'm really big on reach when it comes to game design, so I want something that can hit a nice, big, wide, large, or whatever area as much as I can, right? So, whonk! But there are a lot of other feasible and reasonable possibilities, too. The fireballs, or the homing missiles, or the pillar. Actually, the pillar was extremely useful because it's not just utility, but you can put it in a boss's hitbox, or hurt box. No, that would be hitbox, I'm right. So they just take damage for every second that it's in there. This is what I'm talking about. There are a number of different possible builds, and pretty much all of them are feasible to some extent or another. Obviously, some are going to specialize better in other things. That's how that works. But in a normal playthrough, you're good, right? I also mention this, though, because this game does have a form of New Game Plus. Now, I say a form. Not everything carries forward. Some of the relics don't, which is a damn shame. I would really love it if I would keep the Wii relic, which allows you to just kind of go up infinitely. That would have been awesome. But you do keep the dash relic. You do keep your orbs and their levels, and your familiars and their levels, and your equipment, and your items, and all that stuff. So you keep most of the things. You're probably thinking, well, this sounds like a great New Game Plus. It would be if it didn't essentially erase your save in the process. The fact that you can only do that, so you're locked into a save slot, is what it is. So if you do New Game Plus here and then you save, well, that save is gone. This is actually one of the reasons we didn't do this on camera, was because I wanted to go back and see the other two endings. And by other two, I mean 2 of 4, so we only saw 3. Moving on. So, good New Game Plus, good build gameplay, good Metroidvania expansion, exploration, and design. The platforming isn't quite, like I mentioned. The combat is enjoyable. You can be, as with the build, and partially because of the build, there's a lot of different possible tactics you can use with regards to each combat encounter. And that's entirely up to you. That's part of the build gameplay. But you're probably thinking, Laura, why haven't you talked about the thing everyone talks about? Well, first of all, because everyone talks about it. But second of all, no words I give you will get it across. This game has very good music, but this game is also absolutely gorgeous. This is, without hyperbole, some of the best sprite work and brickwork I have ever seen. Ever. This is some damned good stuff. And I can't describe that in words. Laura, just put it on the background. Okay, we've covered that 1,000 times, why we don't put footage in the background. This is the post-stream. So you want to see it, go watch the stream. That's what the VOD's for. I highly recommend you go watch the VOD. It was a great run. We actually got a friend of the developer in during part of it, which was actually awesome to get a little bit of insight material and information about how the game was going, and to just kind of gush about it because it's a damn good game. By the way, there is a sequel coming, which is awesome. But I'm only mentioning that because that's going to come up in a minute. I could keep talking about the gameplay. I could talk about some of the boss design. A lot of the bosses are there. One of the only gameplay negatives I gave the game was for the fact that, especially early on, a lot of the bosses just have entirely too much health. Especially given they don't really have any significant attack patterns. So you're just, okay, attack, jump. Attack, jump. And it's okay. So as much as I praise the combat, especially early on, some of the bosses are just not right there. But there is a good enemy variety, so some of the later things will work. And one of my favorite enemies in the game, which is actually, one of my favorite bosses in the game, is actually the Raven Lord, which is a boss that actually utilizes its arena properly and has a wide variety of attacks which actually take advantage of the different vectors it can attack you from. A homing attack, a line attack, which you can push back against, it can grab you and throw you against the wall, and it can teleport, and all of this works very well on a spiked platform. Don't worry, it's not Bob's spikes. They don't kill you instantly. And I'm having to platform and move around while doing it. It's an awesome fight. I loved it. The final fight was pretty cool too, but I can only talk about that while talking about spoilers. So, this is, as usual, your spoiler warning. This is definitely a spoiler warning for this game. So, spoilers. As usual, we'll do our 3 count. The narrative of this game is interesting for many reasons, and I'm not going to go a full play-by-play. That's not the point of the post-stream summary. The point of this is to try and summarize the stream for those of you who don't have time to watch the whole stream. The thing that's been stuck in my head the most is that this is a macroscopic story told from a microscopic perspective, and I love that. To explain that a little bit, I talk a little bit about the difference between macro and micro narratively. Micro is a story about 2 people who are running a bar, and they're trying to keep the bills paid, and there's this person who showed it. We recently played Valhalla, VA11 Hall A. That's a micro story. A macro story is big and impacting, and the world's going to end, and you get the idea. Final Fantasy IV is a macro story. Now, the two are not mutually exclusive. You can have macro in micro and vice versa. But so rarely do you tell a macro from a micro perspective, or vice versa. Because this is a story about time, and how time is being restructured and reshuffled by dreamers, who may or may not be referred to as gods, depending on how you define that, who are kind of disagreeing with each other on certain things. So, as a direct consequence, one of them has decided to move pieces on the board to utterly change and restructure the status quo and rewrite the entire galaxy. That's the plot. But what is the primary focus of the story? Well, obviously it's on us, the main character, right? Well, actually, we don't get that much other than being a vector for certain other people's stories. No, the majority percentage of the story is all about our little friends at the camp, the Villette friends. By the way, I have no idea how to pronounce any of these. I apologize in advance if I'm screwing this up. The Villations, right? All those people who were left behind when they evacuated and the portal was sealed. These people, that's the majority of our storytelling. Is Queen Aelana, I think is how it's pronounced, is she the big evil temptress? I mean, you do fight her, right? She's a big villain. She has hatred and rage, and she's the cause of all this, and so forth and so on. Well, no, we actually get to learn quite a bit about her, especially in the little journal entries, about how she was at a young age taken in by the magocracy, about how that she was pulled in of the elite, and then she was sent here and kind of learned and grew and fell in love with one of the people, Miss Philia. Princess Philia, and ended up going back and being an advocate for these people. So I suppose I should rewind a second to give you a little bit of context for those of you who have no idea what I'm talking about. There's a planet. This planet is bathed in this radiation. That's important. Keep it in mind for later. We call it plasma. So there's this plasma, and they're like, wee. But then they find this other planet. They warp over here, and oh my god, it's horrible. It's rich in resources, but just being here infests them with this horrible disease, which they call the bleakness. Remember that one, too. So they end up leaving there. But then the evil, and I do mean evil, Emperor, I could never remember his name, Emperor Terrible, says, you know what I should do? I should be even more evil. And I'm just going to start kicking people out to their, we'll call it banishment, exile, because he's performing a degree of cleansing, ethnic cleansing, because his overall approach is he is very mage-centric. He wants to have a mage-only society, and so any mundane is being removed from the equation, either by being banished or simply being treated as such a second-class citizen that they can be killed without consequence because they have no legal rights. Oh, also, the magics are forbidden to interact with or acknowledge or have sex with or have children with or be with the mundanes. Now, you might think, well, that's pretty horrible on many levels, and it is, but remember, ethnic cleansing. This is a matter of trying to filter bloodlines. Now, there's a bloody subtle point that I'm not sure, I don't want to say that. That sounds so egotistic. I'm not sure how many people caught this. But there's a bloody subtle point where it mentions that Aelana, she was born to mundanes. In other words, just like in Harry Potter, magical aptitude actually has nothing to do with your bloodline. It's a scam. It's a sham. It has nothing to do with anything. You just are born with magical aptitude, or you are not. The end. And so this whole attempt to try and purify the bloodline isn't going to work. Then we add into that the fact that he's sending people out there for being political dissidents, or people who don't agree with him, or people who were wearing pink on the wrong day, or, whatever. And you get the general idea. All of this is told from a very micro perspective, from the perspective of people who are mundanes, like the injured soldier, Hashem, who was I forget what they called it, portal patrol. In other words, fodder. He was there to die and give his life for the magicals who were able to escape. We also see this through the perspective of several of the magicals, some of which are defectors from decadence, to use the TV tropes term, and some of which kind of believed in it, sort of, but not really. My personal favorite, and I'm terrible with names, Niliste? No, Nil is the one that we fall in love with. No, it's the tall woman with the mohawk. And I know that sounds weird because you're like, she's just an intolerant dickhead. No. One of the things I talk about a lot when it comes to analyzing fiction and real life is the concept of a core. Everyone has a different core. Not everyone has a core. What that core is can change over time, but this is your reason, your reason for bothering, your reason for trying, the thing that really, really, really matters. No, really. This is actually part of your core central identity. Now, not everyone has a strong core. Some people have a core that's some other person, maybe a loved one, maybe a child, maybe a parent. Some people have a core that's a hobby. And, I mean, absolutely no offense by this, but that's not very strong. And therefore, if something happens to that hobby, if you can't afford it anymore, or you lose the ability to do it, like something happens to your hands, your eyes, or whatever, well, that can devastate you. Doctor Strange, over in his thing, his core was being an excellent surgeon, being the best. That was his core. He lost that because of the injury on his hands. So he had to find a new one. Right? You get the idea. Miss Mohawk Lady, I feel stupid for not remembering her name. She is someone who had a core of being a part of the military. And by sheer virtue of that, that means she was part of the upper class, the elite, the mages, the haves. That was her life. She had to believe in it, because if she loses that, well, then her whole life has been for nothing. It's all been for nothing, and all of this has just been like I can't just this is a form of sunk cost fallacy. All that time and effort I put into it has to mean it was worthwhile, has to mean it's good enough for me to keep going with, right? During the course of her and others' quests, we actually slowly pry this apart and effectively just get her to get to the point where she can accept what she already knows. Because she knows it was a crap system. She knows it was garbage. She knows about how bad things were. But it was all she had. We give her a new core, this new family, this new purpose, this new cause. And in all of the endings that I saw, all three of them, she gets a very good, happy ending of finding a new core. In fact, she specifically becomes part of the military. And you're probably thinking, lore. No. Idealized military. Helping people, protecting people, safeguarding, defending. She does exactly what she wants to do. And that arc is beautiful in its own right. And all the characters, I'm not going to go through all of them. All the characters have some degree or another of such an arc. And that's awesome. We fall in love, our character falls in love with, what's her face? I can't remember her name. Was Nil? I'm pretty sure her name was. We actually also have the two gentlemen link up, which is really adorable because they're like, oh, yeah. And we're like, hey, I'm thinking about someone. We just practically elbow them in the stomach every time we talk to them. But you see what I mean by I say the story is actually very much a microscopic perspective. It is as zoomed in as it can get. And we get insights onto the time alterations, the cities, the war, the nations, the culture, all from the perspective of individuals. We never actually see any of this stuff personally, probably because of the limitations of the game and time and blah, blah, blah. And in the end, we can choose how we go through this. Now, so you can go and kill the Emperor, or you can go back and live with your... Well, actually, no, you kill the Emperor one way or the other. And then you could become the new Empress and rule on high as Sultana. Or you can go and live and be with your family and your lover. Or you can kill the god of time. So here's the thing. There's this thing called the Timespinner. This is one of the biggest question marks I am left with at the end of this one. Because there's lots of discussion about the Timespinner and how it works, but absolutely no information about where it came from or why. There's just there. And there's this tribe of people who have been using it to try and escape being pursued by the evil empire, which obviously would have a vested interest in having access to a functional time machine, which can also teleport you anywhere. Anytime, any place. That is the tool, the weapon. So of course they're interested in it, right? But why do these random tribal people have it? Where did they get it? Why does it operate the way it does? All of these are questions that are not answered, and I got most of the lore in this one. I am very much hopeful that the sequel will answer this. Remember I mentioned that earlier? But I mentioned this as well because one of the provisos of the Timespinner is you use it and then you are removed from time. Or more accurately, your history is wiped from time. And instead what happens is the new you gets to live in the altered timeline and you never were born. Now that can have various consequences, including loss of family and whatnot. And they have a whole culture built around this. You come in, you approach in a certain way, we embrace you in a certain way. You know, we try to bring you in and give you your new family since you've lost your old one, since you've just sacrificed so much for this. Sacrifice is a big theme in this game. Along with things are more complicated than they seem, which is another one of my own dings to the story. They say that so many times, I'm like, okay, game, I get it. Come on. I know it. I get it. Okay. But what I think is actually happening is I don't think the Timespinner has any consequences of its usage. Now what you're thinking, lore, it gets rid of you from time. I don't think that's true. One of the things we do know is that the Sandman, the god of time, is someone who is cleaning up after us as we go temporally altering things. Fixing and readjusting and getting stronger in the process. Now this is never said out loud, but I think what actually happens is he, or it, I don't know, looks at the temporal alterations from the Timespinner and says, oh, okay. Just removes that person from the time stream, cleans it up, and there you go. Boom, you're good. Why? Because it's a neat, clean, quick, and easy solution to the time traveler's exemption clause, something I've talked about several times recently. So, they're not really immune to the time travel. It's more like the time travel completely goes on without them, and that's all adjusted as a consequence. We also find out that every time these temporal incursions are happening, the god of time is getting stronger. Why? Well, it wouldn't really surprise me if what was happening is these deleted timelines and lives and universes and all that were just kind of ending up in the end of time, the pyramid at the very end. Question mark, question mark, question mark, question mark. And we know that they don't go away immediately, because they're not gone when we kill them. We have the opportunity to put everything back. So, where do they go? I think he's eating them, which is exactly as horrible as it sounds. Not all. No, I mean just absorbing and growing stronger with these continued alterations and the consumption of the time ways thereof. Which is interesting, because he then decides that he's had enough at a certain point and just doesn't want to do his job anymore after we do such a massive alteration to the timeline that, we kind of force his hand, so to speak. And all of this is being pressed by a cute, adorable, voiced by a baby cat, dragon named Mief? I have no idea. Like I said, pronunciations. And we never find out what their motivations are in any real sense of the word. They're just kind of there. Pushing us along, getting used to us, encouraging us, talking us through this, and then enabling us to become the new god of time, the status quo alteration I mentioned earlier. Now, from my perspective, this seems relatively simple. There are two gods playing chess. But none of these things are actually answered in the work. Normally, this is when I'd say, here's my in-depth analysis on this, but I guess I already did that, so my apologies. I'm curious what you think is going on, and why. And of course, I am very curious to see what happens in the sequel. Whenever it comes out, no rush. Don't crunch. Don't do what I'm doing. I gotta start a new stream in like 10 minutes here, so don't do what I'm doing, for example. And I just would really love to know more about the people and the culture. Why does the plasma affect them so? Why can they not cure it? They have the ability to give them plasma and do other things, but they never actually cure it. What's up with the demons? I barely mentioned that in this rumination, but there are demons who are like in the background of almost everything that's going on. They're mentioned to be psychic entities, is actually the term used for them. So thought entities, if you will. And there's several references to this all being a dream. So that's probably relevant. Bad dreams, maybe. Either way, all of these are questions that I have no answers for, but I did very much enjoy this game. And I hope you do and did. And I will see you next time.